On a freezing night in East Harbor, everyone ignored the old man stumbling through the snow. Everyone except an 18-year-old delivery biker named Julia Fuller. She thought he was just lost. She didn't know she was carrying a mafia boss on the back of her bike. By morning, her face would be on every gang's hit list. Before we dive in, tell me, would you have stopped? And don't forget to subscribe if you believe one act of kindness can still change a life. The wind off the East River cut through the city like a blade. Streetlights flickered over cracked pavement, their glow swallowed by fog and falling snow. Garbage cans rattled in the alleyways, the air thick with the smell of oil, smoke, and something metallic. The kind of night that made you question if the city had a heart at all. Julia pedaled fast, her breath sharp in the air, hands stiff inside torn gloves. Her second-hand bike squealed every time she turned, its chain whining like it was begging for mercy. Her delivery bag bounced against her hip, lukewarm takeout that needed to be at a client's door 10 minutes ago. "Come on," she muttered under her breath. "Just one more run." 18 years old and already exhausted. She had no time for school, no time for dreams. Just the grind, the endless race between cold air and unpaid bills. Deliveries paid by the mile, not by the hour. Every second mattered. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She ignored it. When it buzzed again, she sighed and checked. "Don't be late again. Last strike." Her boss's words glared through the cracked screen. Julia shoved the phone back and kept going, head low against the wind. The snow was falling harder now, the streets empty. The usual noise, the shouting, the engines, the catcalls, had vanished under the storm's hush. Only her tires made sound, crunching through the slush, tracing thin black lines down the deserted road. She took a corner fast, almost skidding on the ice, and that's when she saw him. An old man standing near a flickering streetlight, one hand gripping a rusted bus sign, the other clutching a crumpled paper. His coat was too thin, scarf half undone, blood dried in a thin line down his temple. He wasn't moving right, like the cold had frozen his thoughts mid-step. Julia slowed. One foot touched the ground, steadying herself. The man mumbled something she couldn't catch. Maybe a name. Maybe nonsense. Cars passed. No one stopped. She bit her lip. "Don't," she whispered to herself. "Not tonight." The clock on her phone read 9:12. The delivery had to be done by 9:30. One more delay, and she'd lose the job, lose the room she rented by the week. But the man looked lost in a way that made her chest tighten. Not just confused, haunted. Like the world had erased him and he was still trying to figure out why. She gripped the handlebars. "Keep going," she told herself. "It's not your problem." But her mother's voice, soft and far away, crept into her mind. "If you see someone alone like that, baby, you stop. Doesn't matter who they are." Julia cursed under her breath, turned the bike around, and coasted back. "Sir," she called gently. "You okay out here?" The man blinked through the snow, his eyes cloudy, voice thin. "Vinny, the docks. I think I missed it." "Missed what?" Julia asked. "The boat or the bus?" "I can't remember." Up close, he looked even worse. Skin paper thin, lips cracked from the cold, shoes soaked through and splitting at the seams. "Where do you live?" she asked. He frowned as if the question itself hurt. "By the river. Maybe. I just need to get home." Julia looked down the empty street. The last bus had come and gone hours ago. "Yeah," she sighed. "You're not getting there tonight." She pulled the scarf from around her neck and wrapped it over his. He tried to protest, but she didn't let him. "Come on," she said, tapping the back rack of her bike. "Sit here. I'll take you somewhere warm." The old man hesitated. "I don't want to be trouble." "Too late," she said, half smiling. "Trouble's my middle name." He gave her a small, shaky smile, one that seemed to surprise even him. Julia helped him onto the rack, careful of his weight. "Hold on tight," she said. This thing's old and cranky just like you. He chuckled, low and tired. You remind me of someone. Yeah? Julia asked, adjusting her gloves. Hope she's a good person. She was, he murmured. Until the world wasn't. Julia pushed off the curb. The tires slipped for a second, then caught. The snow hit her face like needles, but she kept pedaling. Behind her, the man hummed something faint, a melody that sounded older than the city itself. Julia's chest ached, and she didn't know why. Maybe it was the song, maybe the silence between them, or maybe the weight of the world she kept trying to outpace. You're freezing, she said over her shoulder. Hang in there. He didn't answer, just whispered again. The docks. Vinny knows. Julia frowned but kept going. We'll figure it out in the morning, okay? The wind roared louder as they turned onto River Street. The lamplight broke across patches of black ice, the shadows stretching long and strange. Julia focused on the road, breathing hard. Every pedal was a war between reason and compassion. You just threw away your job, her mind hissed. Maybe not, her heart whispered. She passed shuttered storefronts and sleeping cars buried in snow. The city felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. Not far now, she called, though she had no idea where they were going. The man leaned closer, his voice barely audible. It's colder than it used to be. Yeah, she said, her breath turning white. World's meaner, too. He laughed softly. Not all of it. Julia looked back at him and saw that ghost of a smile again. Somehow, it made the night feel less cruel. A car splashed past, horn blaring, icy slush spraying over them both. Julia swore, shaking her head. People are wild, she muttered. Always have been, the man said, voice trembling but calm. They rode past the edge of the city, where the asphalt cracked and snow swallowed the road. Julia stopped under a broken streetlight and pulled a thin blanket from her delivery bag, the one meant to keep the food warm. She wrapped it around his shoulders, tucking it close. You're gonna be fine, old man, she said softly. I promise. He nodded weakly, eyes half closed. You shouldn't have stopped. Yeah, Julia said, smiling faintly. People keep telling me that. She climbed back on, kicked off the curb, and pedaled harder. The wind tore at her jacket, but she leaned forward, pushing against it with everything she had. Every turn of the wheel echoed like a heartbeat. Steady, defiant. Behind her, the man's voice broke through the snow one last time. You remind me of her, he whispered again. Julia didn't ask who. The streets blurred around them, the frozen lamps, the dark river, the sound of tires cutting through silence. And somewhere in that endless cold, a strange kind of warmth bloomed between them. Julia didn't know it yet, but the stranger on her bike wasn't just a lost old man. He was Johnny Houston, the missing king of the East Harbor Mafia. And by morning, that one act of kindness would make her the most hunted girl in the city. The snow hadn't stopped falling. It came down in slow, relentless waves, blanketing East Harbor until the streets looked like they'd never been alive at all. Julia's tires hissed through the slush, each turn heavier than the last. The old man on the rack behind her hadn't spoken in minutes. His head rested against the delivery bag, eyes half closed, breath shallow. Almost there, she murmured, even though she had no idea where there was. Her legs burned, lungs raw from the cold. Every block they passed seemed emptier than the one before. Storefronts shuttered, neon lights flickering and dying behind fogged glass. East Harbor at night was a graveyard with street lamps. When she saw the sign for Rosie's Diner, a flicker of relief passed through her chest. The red neon buzzed weakly, the only splash of color in the whiteout. She skidded to a stop at the curb, propped the bike against a snowbank, and turned to the man. Come on, she said gently. Let's get you warm. He blinked slowly as if waking from a dream. Is this the docks? Not exactly, she said. But they've got coffee. You look like you could use a gallon of it. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. The heater rattled, the windows fogged from steam and grease. A jukebox in the corner hummed quietly, playing a song older than both of them. Julia guided the man to a booth near the back. His hands trembled as he sat, the leather squeaking under his weight. She peeled off her gloves and rubbed her fingers together, watching him from across the table. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. His eyes darted toward the window as if the question itself scared him. I don't remember." Julia frowned. "You don't know your name?" He shook his head. "Just pieces. Vinny. The ducks, my boys." They turned. She leaned forward. Turned. Turned how? He rubbed his temples, groaning. Something went wrong. "I can't remember what." Julia exhaled softly. "Okay. It's fine. We'll figure it out." A waitress appeared, mid-40s with tired eyes and a smile too kind for this part of town. Her name tag said May. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" she asked. "Just 2 coffees," Julia said. "And maybe something hot if you can spare it." May glanced at the old man. "He okay?" Julia nodded quickly. "Yeah. Just cold." When the waitress walked away, Julia opened her delivery bag. Inside were 2 untouched orders, a burger and some soup. She slid the soup across the table toward him. "Eat. It's not much, but it's warm." He looked at her, hesitant. "You don't have to." "Yeah, I do," she said, forcing a small grin. "Otherwise I'll feel like a jerk." He gave a ghost of a smile and picked up the spoon. His hands shook so badly the broth nearly spilled, but he steadied himself. For a moment, Julia thought she saw something in his expression, a flicker of authority, a kind of presence that didn't belong to a frail old man. Then it vanished. May returned with 2 steaming mugs. "On the house," she said softly. "He reminds me of my dad." "Thanks," Julia said, sliding a few crumpled bills across the counter anyway. Her last $5. She didn't care. The old man drank slowly, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. "Vinny," he whispered again. "Don't trust Vinny." Julia frowned. "Who's Vinny?" He shook his head. "My right hand. Or was." Julia leaned back. "You were in the Navy or something?" "No," he said after a pause. "Something worse." Before she could ask, May returned, tray in hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Honey, you said he didn't know his name, right?" "Yeah." "Why?" May bit her lip. "Because I swear I've seen him before. Years ago. He looks just like Johnny Houston." Julia blinked. "Who?" May's voice dropped lower. "The mob guy. The one who disappeared. They say he's dead." Julia laughed softly, half nervous. "You think this guy's a mob boss? Come on." But May didn't laugh. "I'm serious. Look at him. That face, those eyes. It's him." Julia turned to the man. He looked back, eyes cloudy but sharp beneath the fog. There was something in the way he held himself now, his shoulders straighter, his gaze heavier. For a heartbeat, she almost believed it. Then the bell over the door jingled. 2 men stepped in. Black coats. No snow on their shoulders, like they hadn't been outside long. They scanned the diner slowly, eyes sweeping each booth. Julia's heart started to pound. One of them spoke to May. "Hey, miss. We're looking for someone. Old man. About yay tall. Seen him?" May hesitated, glancing at Julia's table. The man in the booth stared down at his coffee, hands tightening around the cup. Julia's pulse kicked into overdrive. She forced a smile at the waitress. "Restroom?" she asked quickly. "Back there," May murmured, nodding toward the hall. Julia slid out of the booth, grabbed the old man's arm and whispered, "Come on. Don't say a word." They slipped into the narrow hallway as one of the men turned. Julia caught his reflection in the metal napkin holder. Sharp jaw, eyes like glass. He saw movement. "Hey." Julia shoved open the restroom door and pushed the man inside. "Stay here. Don't move." "What's happening?" he rasped. "Nothing good." She turned, slipped out, and darted through the kitchen. The smell of frying oil hit her like a wall. A cook shouted, "Hey!" But she didn't stop. She burst out the back door into an alley thick with snow and steam. The cold slapped her across the face. She ran to her bike, heart hammering, breath coming in clouds. Within seconds, the old man appeared behind her. He'd followed her out, stubborn even in his confusion. "Come on," she hissed, helping him onto the rack again. Gunmetal voices echoed down the alley behind them. "Check the back. She's got him." Julia kicked off hard. The tires spun, caught, and they shot forward. Headlights burst into the alley, blinding her for a split second. She turned sharply into a side street, nearly losing control. The old man clung to the seat, trembling. "Who are they?" she shouted over the wind. "Not friends," he said grimly. "Not anymore." Snow whipped past their faces. The sound of engines roared behind them. Julia pedaled faster, weaving between cars half buried in white. She turned onto the bridge. Beneath her, the river glowed faintly with reflected light. It looked calm from above, but the current could kill a person in seconds. "Hang on," she yelled. They hit the far side and ducked down another alley. The chase noises faded, replaced by sirens in the distance. Julia didn't slow until the lights were gone. They coasted to a stop under an overpass. The old man's breathing was ragged, visible in the air. Julia jumped off the bike, pacing, trying to catch her breath. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. "They found me," he whispered. "Who found you?" "The men who used to work for me." Julia stared at him. "You keep saying stuff like that. My boys, Vinny, used to work for me. What are you even talking about?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a brief moment the confusion vanished. What replaced it was something heavy, sharp, and terrifyingly certain. "My name," he said quietly, "is Johnny Houston." Julia froze. That's not possible. "You're dead," he finished. "So they said." He leaned back against the cold concrete, eyes distant. "They tried to end me. But I got out. I don't know how. Someone helped me and I ran. I've been walking ever since." Julia swallowed hard. "You're saying you're the Johnny Houston, the mafia guy." "I'm saying," he murmured, "that you just saved the wrong man." For a moment, the only sound was the river and their breathing. Julia turned away, rubbing her forehead. "You've gotta be kidding me. You're either crazy or what?" he asked softly. "Telling the truth?" She didn't answer. The snow fell harder now, piling on the street in thick waves. Somewhere in the city, police sirens wailed faintly. Somewhere else, gunfire cracked in the distance. Julia knelt beside her bike, brushing off the snow. Her scarf, the one she'd given him, was still around his neck. She sighed. "Well, Johnny Houston or not," she said, "you're freezing. And I'm not about to let you die in front of me. So, congratulations, you're stuck with me." He stared at her, eyes narrowing as if trying to read her. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "Because no one else would," she said quietly. He didn't answer, but something in his face softened again. For a second, he looked small, just a tired old man who'd lost his way. They sat there for a while, the silence stretching between them, heavy and strange. "If you'd protect a stranger just because it's right," the narrator's voice murmured, "hit subscribe. Sometimes kindness doesn't pay back in comfort. It pays back in chaos. But it still matters." Julia finally stood, brushing snow from her jacket. "Come on. We need to move before those guys circle back." They climbed onto the bike again. The city around them was half asleep, its lights dim under the weight of the storm. Julia's legs trembled from exhaustion, but she kept pedaling. The road gleamed like black ice beneath the snow, reflecting every headlight that passed. The old man leaned close, whispering just loud enough for her to hear. "They'll come again." "Who?" "My family," he said. "What's left of it." The words made her stomach twist. She didn't reply. She couldn't. By the time they reached the next block, the snow had turned the world into a blur of white and shadows. Julia slowed, glancing over her shoulder. No cars. No headlights. Then her phone buzzed. She pulled it out of her pocket, thumbed the screen, and froze. A photo filled the display. Grainy, low light, taken from a street camera outside Rosie's diner. Her. The old man. Her scarf around his neck. The caption beneath read, "Who is the girl with Johnny Houston?" Julia's stomach dropped. Oh no. The old man looked over her shoulder, his expression grim. "It's begun." She shoved the phone back into her pocket, heart pounding. "We need to disappear," she whispered. The snow swallowed their tracks behind them as she pedaled into the dark. Two silhouettes vanishing into a storm that didn't care who they were or what they'd just started. And somewhere deep in East Harbor, a dozen men in black coats stared at that same photo glowing on their phones, the name Julia Fuller already written on their list. The wind howled through the broken windows of the old warehouse, carrying the sound of the river like a low growl. Rusted signs hung half-detached from the walls, clanging in the storm. Julia's flashlight beam wobbled across stacks of abandoned crates and twisted metal as she pushed the bike inside. "All right," she said, voice breathless from the cold. "We can stay here for a bit. It's not much, but it's dry." Johnny didn't answer right away. He moved slowly, careful with every step, the stiffness in his body making him look even older than he was. Julia helped him to a worn-out chair near the corner, dust puffing up as he sat. The warehouse was one of those forgotten delivery depots near the docks, the kind of place where time had stopped but the smell of oil and cardboard never left. Julia set her bike against the wall and brushed snow off her shoulders. Her hands were shaking, part exhaustion, part fear she didn't want to name. She glanced toward the broken window, half expecting headlights to slice through the dark at any second. "You need to rest," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "You've been through hell, old man." Johnny looked up slowly, his eyes unfocused but not empty. "I've been through worse." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. I'd say almost getting shot and chased through alleys in a blizzard ranks pretty high." He didn't smile. Instead, his gaze drifted to the far corner of the warehouse, where faded letters still read, "East Harbor Freight and Shipping." He whispered something, too soft to catch. "What was that?" Julia asked. "Home," he murmured. "Used to run shipments out of here. Long time ago." Julia frowned. "Shipments? Like what?" He rubbed his forehead, grimacing. "I can't remember everything. Just flashes. The docks. The family. Vinny." That name again. She crouched beside him, holding the flashlight closer. "You keep saying that name. Vinny. Who is he?" Johnny's jaw tightened. "He was supposed to be my right hand. My brother in everything but blood." He paused. "And he sold me out." The words hung in the cold air, heavy and final. Julia straightened slowly. "You mean he tried to kill you?" Johnny nodded, his voice low. "The last thing I remember before waking up in that alley was the sound of gunfire. My boys were there. They turned. Vinny gave the order." Julia exhaled hard. "Jesus." She rubbed her arms, pacing a few steps. "And now they're after you again. Which means they're after me too." She walked over to her bag and pulled out her phone. "I need to know who I'm really helping here." The screen lit her face in blue light as she typed Johnny Houston into the search bar. Within seconds, results filled the page. Old news clips, crime reports, interviews. The headlines made her stomach twist. Johnny Houston, the gentleman king of East Harbor. Feared mob boss missing, presumed dead. Federal crackdown leaves Houston family leaderless. Julia scrolled through photos. Grainy shots of men in suits, black cars, warehouse raids. And then one that stopped her cold, a younger Johnny in a long coat, standing beside a group of men at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. His expression calm, confident. That same piercing look she'd seen earlier in the diner. Her hand trembled. "You've got to be kidding me." Johnny looked up from the shadows. "What?" "You," she said quietly. "You're not just some random old guy. You're—" He finished it for her, his voice rough. "Johnny Houston." Julia shook her head. "You're the guy half this city's afraid of. The guy they said disappeared after that shootout by the river. The one who kept people safe," he interrupted. His tone wasn't angry, but there was steel beneath it. "From worse men than me." Julia laughed bitterly. "That's one way to rewrite history." "I never said I was a saint." "No," she said, eyes narrowing. "You just forgot to mention you were the Johnny Houston. I should have left you at that bus stop." He didn't flinch. "Maybe. But you didn't." Julia backed up, running a hand through her hair. "You don't get it. If they're hunting you, they'll come for me next. My name's already out there." She grabbed her bag and moved toward her bike, but Johnny's hand shot out, fast. Far faster than she expected from a man his age. His grip closed around her wrist, firm but not cruel. "You saved me," he said quietly. "That means something." Julia froze. His eyes, half-lidded and weary, were burning with something else now, clarity. "You could have left me to die," he said. "But you didn't. Don't run from that now." She swallowed hard. "You think gratitude's gonna stop your enemies from finding us?" "I think it's the only reason I'm still breathing." His hand loosened, but she didn't pull away. Not yet. Outside, the wind moaned through the cracks in the walls. Snow slipped in under the door, dusting the concrete floor like powdered glass. Julia sat down across from him, rubbing her wrist absently. "You know they're going to figure it out," she said. "Who helped you? My picture's already online." Johnny leaned back, breathing shallowly. "They already know." And he was right. Somewhere across East Harbor, phones were lighting up, in dim bars, in back rooms, in cars parked under bridges. Grainy CCTV footage. Julia's face, her yellow jacket, the faint outline of the man on the bike behind her. "The boss is alive. And he's got a kid with him." Every whisper carried weight. Every rumor spread like gasoline on fire. Julia's phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a text from her boss. It was from a neighbor. "Julia, cops were here. They broke your door." She stared at the message until the words blurred. Johnny watched her closely. "What is it?" "They raided my place," she said flatly. "Looking for me." He didn't look surprised. That's how they work. First fear, then fire. Julia slammed her phone down, the sound echoing through the warehouse. "You ruined my life in 24 hours. Johnny's voice stayed calm. "Or maybe you just didn't have one worth keeping." That hit deeper than she expected. She looked away, jaw tight. "I had a life," she muttered. "Barely. But it was mine." Silence stretched between them. The kind of silence that felt like confession. Johnny shifted in his seat, wincing. "I didn't choose this, you know. None of it. I built something to protect my people. Then they wanted more. Money. Power. Blood. I turned around and they had their guns pointed at me." Julia met his eyes again, really seeing him. The exhaustion, the regret sitting heavy behind the bravado. "You sound like you're sorry," she said. "Doesn't matter," he replied. "In my world, sorry doesn't change what's done." She sighed, dragging her hand through her hair. "So what now? You hide here until they find us? You said it yourself, they know." He looked up, his gaze sharpening for the first time since she'd met him. We don't hide. We move. Move where? Somewhere safe. And where's that? His lips twitched into the faintest smile. You'll see. Julia scoffed. You've got to be kidding me. You think I'm sticking around for this? He didn't answer. He just leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You've got fire, kid. But fire burns fast when it's alone. She glared. Don't try to make this sound poetic. You're the reason my life's in pieces. He nodded slowly. Maybe. But pieces can still be rebuilt. The sincerity in his tone disarmed her more than any threat could have. She turned away, wrapping her arms tight around herself, staring out the cracked window. Snowflakes drifted down, catching the glow from the city beyond. Distant, unreachable, and cruelly beautiful. Julia whispered almost to herself, "They're really coming, aren't they?" Johnny didn't move. They always come for what they think they own. He rose from the chair, his movements deliberate, and walked toward the window. His reflection glinted in the glass. Frail body, sharp eyes. The ghost of a man who'd once commanded armies in the shadows. "Why tell me all this?" Julia asked finally. "Because you need to know what you walked into," he said. "You saved a man the city calls a monster. And monsters don't get rescued without cost." Her throat tightened. "What do you want from me?" He turned toward her. "Nothing. Except to make sure you live long enough to regret helping me." She almost laughed. Almost. That's comforting. But underneath the sarcasm, her heart was pounding. She wanted to believe she could still walk away. That she could go back to her normal. Forget this ever happened. But deep down she knew better. The world outside didn't forgive. It devoured. And now it had her scent. Johnny moved back to his chair, sitting down slowly. "Get some rest. We'll need to move before dawn." Julia didn't argue. She lay down on a dusty tarp, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. The cold pressed against her bones, but her thoughts burned hot. What had she done? The old man's voice came again from the darkness. Quiet but certain. "You're in it now, kid," he said. "And they don't let people walk away." The words echoed long after he stopped speaking. Outside, the wind carried the sound of sirens. Faint at first, then closer, sharper, slicing through the night like a warning. Julia closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Somewhere beyond the walls, East Harbor was already waking up, whispering her name like it belonged to someone else. The morning crept into East Harbor like smoke. Gray, cold, and heavy with silence. Julia hadn't slept. The warehouse walls had groaned all night, whispering with every gust of wind. She lay on the dusty tarp staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn to come and end the long ache of uncertainty. Johnny was already awake, sitting in his chair near the window. The first thin light touched the edges of his face, highlighting the sharpness that age and exhaustion hadn't taken from him. He looked smaller than he had last night, but somehow more alive, like the dawn had pulled his shadow back into focus. Julia pushed herself up. "You didn't sleep." "Couldn't," he said simply. "Old habits. When you spend your life waiting for someone to put a bullet in your back, sleep doesn't come easy." She rubbed her eyes, stretching sore limbs. "Yeah, well, that makes two of us." He smiled faintly. "You'll get used to it." "I'd rather not," she muttered. Before he could answer, a sound echoed outside, the low growl of an engine. Julia froze. Johnny turned toward the door, his expression unreadable. "Stay here," he whispered, standing slowly. The sound grew closer. Tires crunching over ice, a door slamming, then footsteps. Heavy ones. Julia's pulse kicked up again. She reached for her bike chain out of instinct, wrapping it around her hand like a weapon. "Relax," Johnny said quietly. "If they wanted me dead, they wouldn't knock." A moment later, the warehouse door creaked open. A man stepped through, tall, dark coat, gloves on, a face carved with hard years. His eyes flicked to Julia, then to Johnny. "Boss," he said, his voice deep and even. "Took me long enough to find you." Julia blinked. "Boss." Johnny exhaled. "Nico." The man nodded. "You look like hell. Been through worse." "Yeah," Nico said, "but not like this." His gaze slid back to Julia. "And who's the kid?" "Julia Fuller," Johnny said before she could speak. "She saved my life." Nico raised an eyebrow. "Did she now? Hell of a thing, kid. Saving ghosts." Julia crossed her arms. "You're welcome, I guess." He almost smiled. "Feisty. I like her." Then he turned serious. "We gotta move. Word's out you're alive. Vincent's got half the docks crawling with his men." At that name, Johnny's face tightened. "Of course he does." Nico motioned toward the door. "I've got the car out back. Clean plates. Let's go." Julia hesitated. "Wait, where are we going?" Johnny gave her a long look. "Somewhere quiet." The car smelled like old leather and rain. Julia sat in the back, pressed against the window, watching the frozen city blur by. Johnny sat beside her, silent, while Nico drove through the narrow streets with practiced calm. They crossed from East Harbor's industrial belly into a quieter district, rows of old brick buildings and empty storefronts. Eventually, the car slowed in front of a shop with fogged windows and a faded green sign that read Houston's Flowers. Julia frowned. "You own a flower shop?" Johnny smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised how much business you can hide behind daisies." Nico chuckled under his breath. Still running the same front after all these years. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant, lilies, roses, and fresh soil. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. A middle-aged woman behind the counter looked up and froze. "Mr. Houston," she whispered. Her hands trembled, nearly dropping the vase she was arranging. Johnny nodded gently. "It's all right, Maria. I'm home." She set the vase down, tears welling in her eyes. "They said you were gone." "That." "I'm not," he said, voice low. "Not yet." Maria wiped her eyes quickly and turned to Julia. "And this is—" "An employee," Johnny said before Julia could protest. "Starting today." Julia blinked. "Wait, what?" "Congratulations," Nico said dryly. "You're now part of Houston's Flowers." Maria smiled, confusion still mixing with relief. "Well, welcome, dear." Johnny led Julia to the back of the shop, past bouquets, through a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of gun oil beneath the perfume of flowers. He opened a door to a small office lined with filing cabinets and a single desk. "This," he said, "used to be my headquarters." Julia's gaze drifted over the photos on the wall. Black and white shots of men in suits shaking hands, newspaper clippings framed like trophies. The words Houston Family Charity Drive appeared in more than one. "You ran your empire from behind a flower shop," she said softly. He smirked. "People let their guard down around beauty. Makes it easier to do business." "What kind of business?" Johnny ignored the question and opened a drawer, pulling out a folded ledger. "You'll be helping Maria up front. Deliveries, inventory, that sort of thing. Don't ask questions about what's in the boxes. And if someone comes in asking for lilacs after midnight, call Nico." Julia frowned. "What's in the boxes?" He looked at her. "You just broke rule number 1. She raised her hands in mock surrender. "Got it. No questions." But questions burned in her anyway, about the people he'd hurt, the empire he'd built, and why he was trusting her at all. Over the next few days, Julia worked the counter. She learned the rhythms of the shop, which deliveries were real and which were code for something else. Men came and went, all polite smiles and quiet tension. One evening, as she was arranging roses, she overheard Nico whispering in the back room. "Vinny's men are getting restless," he said. "They think you're coming for the docks again." "I'm not ready," Johnny replied. "Not yet." You sure the girl's safe here? She's safer with me than out there. Julia pretended not to hear, her hands trembling slightly as she tied a ribbon around the bouquet. When Johnny came out later, he found her still working. You're good with details, he said. You notice things. Hard not to when everyone around here's whispering. He chuckled quietly. Fair enough. He picked up one of the flowers she'd arranged, a white carnation, and twirled it between his fingers. You know what this one means? Julia shook her head. Regret, he said softly. You start learning the language of flowers, you realize they all carry ghosts. She looked at him, seeing the cracks in his mask, the weight he carried behind his calm. You miss it, don't you? The power. The fear. Johnny smiled without warmth. I miss when I thought it meant something. They stood in silence for a while, the shop filled with the hum of the heater and the faint sound of rain against the glass. Julia finally spoke. You don't seem like the monster people make you out to be. He raised an eyebrow. Don't confuse age with innocence. Still, she said quietly, you're not what I expected. He looked at her for a long time. Neither are you. For the first time, his smile reached his eyes. It wasn't warmth, not exactly, but something close. Sometimes, he said, setting the flower down, the people the world calls monsters are just broken souls. Remember that. Julia nodded. Yeah, I guess so. Outside, thunder rolled over the river. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain streaked down the windows, washing the city clean, at least for a moment. Johnny moved to the counter, organizing receipts like he'd done it every day of his life. Discipline, he said almost absently. That's what kept me alive. Not strength. Not fear. Just discipline. You learn to read people. You spot the lie before it kills you. Julia leaned against the counter. You gonna teach me how? He looked up, smiling faintly. You've already started learning. Days turned to weeks. Julia began to move through the shop with ease, arranging bouquets, signing deliveries, memorizing the coded language that passed between Johnny's men. She saw the patterns now. A white rose meant peace, a black tulip meant business, and a box of lilies after dark meant something else entirely. But beneath all that, she saw something unexpected. Johnny wasn't rebuilding his empire. He was watching it, studying it, as if waiting for the moment it would betray him again. Late one night, Julia found him sitting alone in the office, staring at an old photograph. It showed him younger, standing beside a man with slicked hair and a wolfish grin, Vinny. She hesitated at the door. That him? Johnny didn't look up. Yeah, that's him. You were close. Closer than brothers. He set the photo down. That's what makes betrayal hurt. It's never strangers who stab you. It's the ones who swore they wouldn't. Julia leaned against the doorframe. You ever think about walking away? He laughed softly. Every day. But you don't walk away from something like this. You survive it or it buries you. His words settled into her chest, heavy and cold. She turned to leave, but as she did, voices drifted from the hallway. Two men, low, hurried, nervous. She recognized one of them. Nico. Vinny's moving fast, Nico said. He's buying off the cops, trying to take over the docks before you make your next move. He's planning something bigger, the other man said. Something final. Julia froze, her hand still on the doorknob. The men's voices dropped lower. If the boss doesn't act soon, Vinny will. Then footsteps approached. Julia stepped back, heart pounding, slipping quietly into the shadows of the corridor. When the door opened, Johnny stepped out, his eyes dark and distant, his expression unreadable. He didn't notice her standing there, silent, half hidden in the dark. But she saw it, the flicker of something behind his calm, the spark of the man the city once feared. And for the first time, Julia wasn't sure if she was helping a victim or waking up a storm. The rain outside hit harder, a relentless drum against the windows. Johnny's voice, low and cold, carried through the hall as he spoke to Nico. "Vinny wants war," he said. "Then he'll get one." Julia stood frozen in the shadows, realization sinking in. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. The city was still dripping from last night's storm. Rain pooled in the cracks of East Harbor streets, reflecting the neon lights like broken glass. Julia pulled her hood low, the wind slicing across her face as she pedaled through the maze of alleyways behind the flower shop. It had been a week since she overheard Nico talking about Vincent, about the whispers of a takeover. And every night since, she'd seen the same black car parked near the corner after closing. Watching. Waiting. Tonight she decided to follow it. She left the shop an hour after Johnny went upstairs to rest, pretending she was heading home. Instead, she circled the block until the black sedan pulled out. Two silhouettes sat inside, one with Vincent's unmistakable frame, broad shoulders, slicked back hair that glistened even under the dim streetlights. Julia trailed them at a distance, keeping to the shadows. The bike's tires hissed softly on the wet pavement. Her breath came in clouds as she followed the car toward the old industrial district, the same place where Johnny's empire had once been built and nearly buried. The car turned down an abandoned lane and rolled to a stop outside a rusted warehouse. Julia crouched behind a dumpster, her pulse hammering in her ears. The men got out, Vincent in front, laughing with someone who stepped out of the shadows, a man in a dark trench coat with an FBI badge half hidden under his lapel. Her stomach twisted. She pulled out her phone, thumb trembling as she hit record. Vincent's voice was clear despite the wind. "I've delivered everything you asked for. Shipping manifests, accounts, drop schedules. You'll have enough to take Houston's name off the map for good." The agent nodded. "And the witnesses?" Vincent smirked. "Accidents happen. The girl, too. Once he's gone, I'll handle her personally." Julia's blood ran cold. She leaned closer, zooming in, heart hammering so loud she thought they might hear it. But then her elbow brushed a loose metal pipe. It clanged against the ground, sharp and loud as gunfire. Both men froze. "Who's there?" Vincent barked, his head snapping toward the sound. Julia cursed under her breath, shoving her phone into her pocket and sprinting toward the alley. Boots pounded behind her. "Hey! Stop!" She darted between rusted crates and broken fences, the rain turning the ground to slick mud. Her lungs burned, her bike chain rattling wildly as she jumped onto the seat and pedaled for her life. A gunshot cracked behind her, the bullet sparking off a metal post inches from her shoulder. "Keep going," she whispered to herself, legs screaming. The alley opened into the main road. She swerved hard, nearly colliding with a passing truck. Horns blared. Tires screeched. She shot through the chaos, disappearing into the dark. By the time she reached the shop, her arm was bleeding, a deep scrape from falling over a fence. Her clothes were soaked, hair plastered to her forehead. She burst through the back door, panting. Johnny was in the office, half asleep in his chair, the ledger open on his lap. "Julia." His voice was gravel. "What happened to you?" She slammed the door shut and locked it. "Vincent," she gasped. "He's working with the feds." Johnny blinked, confusion clouding his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I saw him. Tonight. I followed him to a warehouse. He was handing over files, deals, everything. He said he was going to finish you off for good." Johnny's expression darkened, but there was disbelief in it, a glimmer of that old loyalty. "No. Not Vincent. He's been with me for 20 years. Julia pulled out her phone, scrolling shakily through the recording. The video was blurry, rain distorting the lens, but Vincent's voice was unmistakable. "Listen," she said, holding it out. Johnny leaned forward, watching in silence. When Vincent's voice said the words "take Houston's name off the map for good," something in Johnny's face changed. The disbelief vanished. All that was left was ice. He stood slowly, closing the ledger with a soft thud. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice so low it barely carried, he whispered, "They tried to bury me alive." Julia didn't move. The air in the room felt colder now, heavier. Johnny looked up, and for the first time, she saw the man the city once feared. His eyes, clear, sharp, unflinching. "Where's the meeting place?" he asked. I don't know exactly," she stammered. "But it looked like Dock 12. Near the river." He nodded. "That's his next shipment. I should have known." He walked to the desk, opening a drawer. Inside was a gun, old, well-kept, the kind that had ended more than a few conversations in his day. He loaded it with mechanical calm. Julia's breath caught. "Johnny, you can't. I'm not letting that snake hand me over to the government like a piece of trash." She stepped closer. "You'll be walking right into his trap." He turned to her, the fire in his eyes tempered by something gentler. "You don't understand, kid. I've lived with blood on my hands for 50 years. But betrayal," he shook his head slowly. "Betrayal burns deeper than any bullet." Julia swallowed hard. "Then let me help you." He frowned. "Help me? I can record him again. Get something you can use, something that proves what he's done. If you kill him, you'll just give them what they want. But if you expose him—" She trailed off. "Maybe you still win." Johnny stared at her for a long time. Then, slowly, he lowered the gun. "You've got more sense than most of the men I ever trained," he said quietly. "You remind me of the way I used to be, before all this." She managed a small, shaky smile. "You mean before the bullets and the blood?" He chuckled, a sound both rough and weary. "Something like that." He sank into the chair again, running a hand through his silver hair. The exhaustion showed through, the kind that went deeper than the body. Julia moved to his side, placing a clean towel over his desk. "Let me patch this up," she said, noticing the fresh bruise on his hand. He didn't argue. Just sat still while she worked, her fingers trembling as she cleaned the wound. "Why'd you help me that night, Julia?" he asked suddenly. She hesitated. "Because no one else did." He nodded slowly. "The world doesn't stop for kindness anymore." "Then maybe it should," she said softly. Johnny looked at her, eyes glinting in the dim light. "You really believe that?" She smiled faintly. "Yeah. Even when it hurts." For the first time that night, something like peace flickered across his face. He reached out, his hand heavy but steady, and rested it on hers. "If I go down," he said, voice low and steady, "you take my seat. Promise me that." Julia's breath hitched. "Johnny, don't. Promise me." She looked into his eyes, saw the weight of decades of sins and losses and ghosts. And though she didn't understand why he trusted her, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I promise." He smiled then, a faint, almost broken smile, and leaned back in his chair. "Good," he said. "Then maybe something I built won't die with me." Outside, thunder rumbled again in the distance. Inside, Julia sat in silence beside the most feared man in East Harbor, realizing that somewhere between the flowers and the blood, they'd both stopped being strangers. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most dangerous thing of all. The storm hadn't stopped for days. Rain smeared the windows of Houston's flowers, washing the world outside into streaks of gray. Inside, the air was tense. Too quiet, too still. Julia stood behind the counter, counting cash from the register, pretending not to notice the two men parked across the street in a black SUV. They'd been there since morning, pretending to read newspapers that were upside down. Vincent's men. They weren't subtle anymore. She'd learned not to flinch, not to let fear show. Johnny had taught her that much. "Control the room, even when you're bleeding," he used to say. "Fear only works if they can smell it." But lately, Johnny wasn't teaching much of anything. He'd gotten weaker. The coughs came more often, the pain in his chest deeper. Sometimes he drifted off mid-conversation, his sharp eyes dimming with exhaustion. So Julia had started speaking for him. At first, just small things. Passing messages, handling deliveries, greeting the men who came through the shop after dark. Then came the meetings. Now she sat across from men twice her age, men who had once killed for Johnny, and spoke with a calm she didn't always feel. It started 3 nights after the warehouse recording. Johnny was too sick to attend a meeting with his old lieutenants. Nico insisted they cancel, but Johnny just looked at Julia and said, "You go." "Me?" she asked, incredulous. "They barely listen to you. They'll eat me alive." Johnny chuckled weakly. Then bite back. So she went. The meeting took place in the basement of an old cigar bar. The air was thick with smoke and suspicion. Half the men there didn't believe she belonged. "Where's the boss?" one asked, leaning forward. His knuckles were tattooed with faded symbols of loyalty. Now just inked lies. "Resting," Julia said coolly. "He trusts me to speak for him." Murmurs rippled around the table. One man laughed under his breath. "Cute." Julia's eyes snapped to him. "You think he'd send someone cute to deal with men like you?" The laughter stopped. She leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to make them lean closer. "He's not gone. He's watching who stays loyal while he's down. You decide what side of that list you want your name on." Silence. The kind that bends the air. And just like that, the tone shifted. When she walked out of that meeting, her hands were shaking, but she didn't let them see. Later that night, Johnny smiled faintly when she told him. "You're learning," he said, coughing into his handkerchief. "Didn't think I'd see the day someone would out-talk Tony Rizzo." "Guess he's not used to women telling him no," Julia said. Johnny chuckled, then winced, clutching his ribs. "You sound like your mother." Julia froze. "You know about my mother?" "I read the file," he said softly. "You didn't think I let anyone this close without checking, did you?" She looked down. "So I'm just another file to you?" "No," he said after a moment. "You're the first person who ever helped me without wanting something in return." The next week, rumors started. Word spread through the docks and alleys that the old man's making a successor. They called her the girl with the yellow jacket, the ghost from the bus stop. Some said she was Johnny's granddaughter. Others whispered she was his weapon, the one he'd unleash if Vincent didn't back down. Julia hated every word of it. She hadn't asked for this. She just wanted to help an old man in the snow. But every act of kindness she gave him pulled her deeper into a world that chewed up better people than her. Now she carried Johnny's phone, signed his name on documents, even gave orders to Nico. She could feel the power settling over her like frost, beautiful, heavy, and suffocating. Sometimes she'd look at her reflection in the shop window and barely recognize herself. The dirt-smudged girl from the streets was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone colder. And yet, beneath it all, her heart still ached for the man upstairs coughing in his chair, the man who'd once ruled a city but couldn't climb a flight of stairs without trembling. She wanted to save him. Not his empire. Just him. That night, as she was closing the register, Nico stepped inside, water dripping from his coat. "We got a problem," he said. Julia didn't even look up. "Let me guess, Vincent." He nodded. "Word is he's putting a bounty on you. Says you've got something he wants." Julia's jaw tightened. "The recording." "Yeah." She sighed. "Then he's going to keep sending people until he gets it." Nico hesitated. "You should go into hiding. Johnny would want." "No," she interrupted. "I'm not running. If I run, I prove him right." He studied her for a long moment. "You sound more like him every day." She didn't know if that was a compliment or a warning. Upstairs, the shop was quiet except for Johnny's labored breathing. Julia sat beside him, holding a cup of tea he didn't touch. "Vincent's spreading stories," she said quietly. He's turning your men. Johnny's eyes flickered open, then turned them back. She frowned. You think I can? He looked at her for a long moment. You already are. She didn't answer. The weight of his trust scared her more than the guns outside ever could. After a while she whispered, You made this world, Johnny. You built it from fear. And now it's eating you alive. He smiled faintly. Maybe that's what I deserve. Julia's voice trembled. You don't get to say that. You don't get to give up when I'm still fighting for you. He turned his head slightly, his hand trembling as it reached for hers. You've got my fire, kid. But fire burns. She held his hand tightly, then let it. For a moment, the air between them softened. The rain outside slowed to a whisper. Then Johnny's phone buzzed on the table. Julia glanced at it. An unknown number. She picked it up. Hello. A familiar voice oozed through the speaker. Calm and venomous. You think you saved him, kid? Vincent's voice drawled. You just signed your death warrant. Julia froze, every muscle in her body locking in place. Tell the old man I'm done playing nice, Vincent said. Next time I see you, there won't be a second chance. The line went dead. Julia lowered the phone slowly, her reflection trembling in the dark window. She didn't say a word, but deep down something in her hardened. The war had begun. Would you risk everything to protect the truth? Subscribe if you believe loyalty still matters. The docks smelled of salt, rust, and betrayal. Fog rolled in off the bay, swallowing the moonlight and muffling every sound except the faint creak of old ropes swaying in the wind. Julia's breath came out in white clouds as she crouched behind a stack of shipping crates, the cold seeping through her gloves. Midnight. This was it, the end of running, the end of pretending. Behind her, Johnny leaned against a post, his breathing shallow but steady. The black coat he wore made him look like the ghost of the man he used to be. Sharp eyes dulled by pain but still dangerous enough to make the shadows hesitate. You sure about this? Julia whispered. He nodded slowly. It's the only way to end it. She looked at him, the memory of their plan replaying in her mind. Vincent thought she'd turned on Johnny. Thought she was desperate to save her own skin. She'd told him she'd deliver Johnny tonight at the docks, in exchange for freedom. What Vincent didn't know was that Julia's phone was already recording, the same way it had the night she caught him with the feds. Once he starts talking, Johnny said softly, don't interrupt him. Let the snake dig his own grave. Julia managed a small, tense smile. You always this poetic before a gunfight? He chuckled, then coughed hard, blood speckling his hand. Just trying to make my last words worth hearing. Don't talk like that. He looked at her, really looked, and for a second the ice in his eyes thawed. You remind me of what I could have been, if I'd had a little more heart and a little less hate. She swallowed the lump in her throat. Then don't make this your last act. Before he could answer, headlights cut through the fog. A convoy of black cars rolled in, their engines purring low and deliberate. Men stepped out, guns tucked under coats, eyes scanning the shadows. In the middle of them Vincent emerged, the same slick hair, the same easy arrogance. Julia, he called out, his voice echoing over the water. Where's the old man? Julia stepped into the open, hands raised. He's here, she said, trying to steady her voice. But you need to promise, you leave me out of this when it's done. Vincent laughed. You really think you can bargain with me? Behind her, Johnny's voice rasped out of the fog. You always did underestimate people, Vinny. Vincent froze, his smirk fading as Johnny stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane. You should have stayed dead, Vincent said, his tone colder now. Johnny tilted his head. And miss watching you sell me out? Not a chance. Vincent's men tensed, hands on their weapons. But none moved. Not yet. You think this changes anything? Vincent sneered. The feds already have enough to bury you. Johnny smiled faintly. That's funny, because I've got enough to bury you too. He gestured subtly toward Julia, who was already holding her phone low, camera rolling. Vincent took a step closer. You brought her into this world, Johnny. She's going to die in it. Julia met his gaze, defiant. Not before everyone sees what you really are. That was the spark. A gun flashed in the dark. The sound cracked through the fog like lightning. Julia dove behind a crate, heart pounding. Bullets tore through the wood. Johnny's men, hidden in the shadows, fired back. Nico's voice roared, "Down!" as chaos erupted. Vincent's men scattered, shouts blending with the deafening rhythm of gunfire. Julia crawled through the smoke, clutching her phone, trying to keep it pointed toward Vincent. She caught him shouting orders, his voice desperate now. "Take them down. I want Houston's head." "Got you," she whispered, zooming in. Johnny moved like a man chasing one last piece of redemption. Slow but precise, every step deliberate. He raised his gun, fired once, and one of Vincent's men dropped. "End of the line, Vinny," Johnny shouted. Vincent spun toward him, eyes blazing. "You don't get to end me." Another gunshot split the air, but this time Johnny staggered. Julia's scream cut through the chaos. "No." She ran to him, dropping beside him as he fell against the crate, blood blooming through his coat. Nico's men closed in, overpowering what was left of Vincent's crew. Vincent himself stumbled backward, gun shaking, cornered by the very men he'd betrayed. One of them, Tony Rizzo, turned his gun on him. "You sold us out, Vinny," he snarled. "You're finished." Vincent's bravado cracked. "You don't understand." "Save it for the feds," Tony spat. Then he nodded to Julia. "You get all that?" She held up her phone, its red light blinking. "Every word." Johnny groaned, his head slipping to her shoulder. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to press against the wound. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're not dying here." He coughed, the sound raw and wet. "Been dying for years, kid." "Don't say that," she begged. His eyes, sharp even through the pain, softened. "You did it. You showed them what loyalty looks like." Tears blurred her vision. "This isn't how it ends." He smiled weakly. "You gave an old man a reason to believe again." Julia's hands trembled harder. "Johnny, please." He reached up, fingers brushing her cheek. "Don't waste it, Julia." Then his hand slipped away, the weight of it leaving a hollow that words couldn't fill. The gunfire had stopped. The fog drifted low over the docks, carrying the faint echo of sirens in the distance. Julia sat there in the cold, holding his head against her shoulder, her breath coming out in broken gasps. Nico approached quietly, placing a hand on her back. "He's gone," he said softly. Julia nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "No. He's free." In the distance, red and blue lights flickered through the mist. And for the first time since that night in the snow, Julia didn't feel afraid, only empty. She slipped Johnny's ring off his finger and closed it in her palm. The docks were silent now. The city had lost its king. But somewhere deep inside her, Julia knew this wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of hers. The world felt quieter after the docks. The gunfire had faded into memory, the blood washed away by the endless East Harbor rain. But for Julia, the silence that followed was louder than any bullet. The news spread fast. Mob boss Johnny Houston surrenders after decades on the run. She watched it unfold on every screen in every diner, his weathered face framed by flashing cameras and cold headlines. They said he'd walked into the police station alone. No lawyer. No entourage. Just a single gold ring glinting under the fluorescent lights as he laid a folder of confessions on the counter. She hadn't known until afterward. By the time Nico called her, it was already done. 3 days earlier, she'd visited him at the hospital. The gunshot had torn through his side, but he was stable, or so the doctor said. He'd looked smaller then, swallowed by white sheets, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "They'll come for you next," he'd warned her. "Vincent's testimony might be dead, but the feds still want blood. And you've been seen beside mine." Julia had shaken her head. "I'm not leaving you." "You don't get to choose that anymore," he'd said, his tone the same sharp command it had always been. "You saved me once. Let me return the favor." She hadn't understood what he meant until it was too late. Now she stood outside the courthouse, cold air cutting through her coat, cameras flashing all around her. Johnny emerged between two officers, wrists cuffed but head high. Even weakened, he walked like a man still commanding a room. Not a prisoner, but a leader making his final move. Their eyes met across the noise, and for a second, the crowd disappeared. He nodded once, faintly. "Trust me." Julia wanted to run to him, to shout that he didn't have to do this, that the truth was already out, that she didn't care what happened to her. But her voice died in her throat. Because deep down, she knew this was the only ending Johnny would ever allow himself. He turned to the cameras, his voice steady as he spoke. "I, Johnny Houston, confess to my crimes. Every deal, every dollar, every life taken under my name. All of it was mine alone. No one else is responsible." Reporters shouted questions, the crowd surged, but Johnny didn't look at them. His gaze flicked once more to Julia before the officers led him away. The last thing she saw was his hand lifting slightly, a gesture that might have been a goodbye, or maybe a warning. The flower shop closed a week later. Maria packed the last of the vases into boxes, her eyes red from crying. Nico disappeared, too. Going south, he'd said, though Julia doubted she'd ever see him again. Julia stayed behind, sweeping the empty floor, the scent of lilies still clinging to the air. On the counter sat an envelope with her name scrawled in Johnny's shaky handwriting. Inside was the gold ring, heavy old, the Houston family crest etched deep into its face, and a note that simply read, "You showed me mercy, kid. Don't ever lose it. J.H." Her tears blurred the ink until the words bled together. She slipped the ring onto a chain around her neck, pressing it to her chest. It felt like carrying both a blessing and a curse. Weeks passed. The first snow of the season fell quietly over East Harbor, dusting the roofs and the riverbanks in white. Julia found herself walking the same streets where it had all begun, where she'd first seen that lost old man beneath the flickering streetlight. The world hadn't changed much. People still hurried past each other, eyes down, shoulders hunched against the cold. But Julia had. Her phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Former mob boss Johnny Houston dies in prison at age 78. She stopped walking. The words hit harder than she expected, even though she'd known this moment was coming. The article said he'd died quietly in his sleep. No struggle. No final outburst. Just gone, like a candle burning down to nothing. She sat on a bench by the river, watching the snow fall into the dark water. Her hands trembled as she took the ring from her coat pocket and turned it in her palm. "Guess you finally got your piece," she whispered. For a moment, she thought about the man she'd met that night. Shivering, confused, half lost in the snow. The man no one else had stopped for. And then she thought of the one he'd become in the end. Not the mobster or the myth, but the man who'd chosen to carry her sins instead of his own. She smiled faintly through the tears. "You got out your way, Johnny. But I'm still here. And I'll make it mean something." The river wind bit through her coat, but she didn't move. She just sat there, letting the silence fill the spaces between memory and grief. She took a deep breath, lifted her phone, and whispered to the small, invisible audience she'd been telling stories to since all of this began. "If you've ever lost someone who changed you for the better," her voice caught, and she smiled sadly, "subscribe. Their light still lives on in your story. And maybe, just maybe, that's how they stay alive." She tucked the phone away and stood, snow crunching under her boots. Above her, the city skyline glowed faintly through the falling snow, harsh and beautiful, just like the man who'd taught her that even in a world full of monsters, Mercy still mattered. Julia turned toward the glow and walked on, the gold ring glinting against her heart, each step carrying her closer to the life Johnny had wanted her to have. The snow kept falling, soft and relentless, until her footprints disappeared behind her, the past fading into white silence. A year had passed since the night the docks went silent. Since the sirens. Since the man the city called a monster traded his freedom for hers. Winter had returned to East Harbor, the same way it always did. Cold, gray, and indifferent. But on the corner of 5th and Harbor, something new stood where Houston's Flowers used to be. A brick building, freshly painted white, with a blue neon sign that flickered softly in the snowlight. The haven for those the world forgot. Inside, laughter echoed off the walls, the kind that came from bellies instead of throats. Kids huddled around tables, painting, reading, arguing over board games. A radio hummed quietly in the background, playing an old soul song that Johnny might have known the words to. Julia Fuller stood near the door, coffee in hand, watching the room with a quiet smile. She looked older now, not in years but in the way the world shapes people who survive it. Her hair was shorter, her eyes softer, but there was still steel beneath them. The gold ring on its chain glinted faintly beneath her collar each time she moved. "Miss Julia," a small voice piped up. She turned to see Malik, 11, gap-toothed, wearing a jacket 2 sizes too big, holding out a paper snowflake he'd cut himself. "What you think?" he asked, shy but proud. Julia took it carefully, pretending to study it. "Looks like perfection to me." He grinned. "You always say that. That's because you keep proving me right." He ran off to hang it on the window, and Julia felt that familiar warmth rise in her chest. The same one she'd felt the first time she'd helped Johnny, the same quiet pull that told her compassion still mattered. Later that afternoon, she sat behind the front desk filling out grant forms when the doorbell chimed. A man stepped inside, early 40s, long coat, camera hanging from his neck. He wiped snow from his shoulders and smiled. "Julia Fuller." She looked up warily. "Depends who's asking." "Michael Trent. Harbor Daily." He flashed a polite grin. "Mind if I ask a few questions? Off the record if you prefer." She hesitated. Reporters had been circling ever since the haven opened. Most of them just wanted a headline that read mob boss's girl turned saint. But there was something different in this man's tone. Not sharp, not hungry. Just curious. "Go ahead," she said finally. He looked around the room, watching the kids chase each other past a mural that read, "You are never too lost to be found." "This place," he said softly. "It used to be Houston's Flowers, right?" Julia nodded. "Yeah." "Named it after him?" She smiled faintly. "No. Named it after what I wish he'd had." He scribbled that down, glancing at her again. "There've been rumors, you know, that you were close to Johnny Houston. That he was a criminal." She interrupted, still smiling. "Yeah, I've heard." He hesitated. "That he left everything to you. That he made you part of his world." Julia leaned back, folding her arms. "People love their myths. Makes life sound like a movie." "So what's the truth?" he asked. She paused, looking past him, through the frosted windows, out into the street where the snow was beginning to fall harder. "The truth?" she repeated, voice soft. "All I did was help a lost old man." Trent looked at her, brow furrowing slightly, as if waiting for more. But Julia didn't say another word. After a moment, he nodded slowly and put his notepad away. "That's a good story," he said quietly. "Maybe the best kind." She smiled. "You'd be surprised what one act of kindness can do." He gave her a small, respectful nod and left, the bell above the door chiming one last time. As evening fell, Julia made her rounds through the center. Malik and 2 other kids were curled up on the couch watching a movie. A pot of soup simmered in the kitchen. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the snow, softer now, almost kind. She stopped at the front window, resting her hand against the glass. In the reflection, she saw the faint outline of herself, and behind it, for just a second, she could almost imagine Johnny's figure, watching quietly from the shadows. "You'd hate this," she whispered with a grin. "All these rules. All this quiet." Then softer. "But you'd be proud, too. I know you would." The reflection faded, leaving only her and the falling snow. She reached into her coat, pulled out the gold ring, and let it rest in her palm. The metal was cold, but the weight of it felt right, a reminder of the man who'd taught her that even monsters could find mercy, and that one act of compassion could change everything. She looked down at the kids, the mural, the warmth spilling out of the kitchen, and thought, maybe this is how redemption looks. Not with power, but with purpose. She took out her phone, opened the recording app, and spoke softly. Not to the city this time, but to the invisible faces who listened to her stories online. "Before I end tonight's story," she said, her voice steady, "I want to ask you something. Do you still believe one act of kindness can rewrite a life? Maybe even save one?" She smiled faintly. "If you do, subscribe. Because I've seen it happen. And I think, deep down, you've seen it too." She slipped her phone back into her pocket and looked out at the street again. Snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the sidewalks, the streetlights, the rooftops of East Harbor. But for the first time in years, it didn't feel like winter was a punishment. It felt like peace. Julia turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the Haven sign burning through the snow. Outside, the city sighed beneath the storm, softened by the hush of forgiveness and new beginnings. And for the first time in years, East Harbor didn't feel so cold.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.